What's cracking, guys? Your boy Daniel DeBrocke here, and today I'm going to show you how to warm up the right way. Now, this is something I see a lot of people making mistakes on, so I wanted to make a video because I get questions about this stuff all the time. So the first thing we're going to do is I want to cover some basic objectives of a warm-up, because a lot of the times when I look at people in the gym or I get new athletes or anything like that, I look at what they're doing for their warm-up, and either they're not aware of what these primary objectives are, or they certainly don't train as if they really respect or acknowledge these things. So I wanted to go over them first and foremost. Now, the first objective of a good quality warm-up is you need to increase your core temperature. You need to get warm. Big shocker there. We want to make sure that the muscles, the joints, the ligaments, all of that stuff is good. It's prepped. It's ready to go, right? A warmer muscle is going to function better. You're going to decrease your risk of injury if you do a proper warm-up. Next, we want to make sure we're prepping the relevant musculature, doing relevant exercise and relevant motor patterns for the training of that day. What do I mean by that? Well, if you have a heavy bench session and you go in, you start walking on the treadmill or riding on the bike, that's a very poor utilization of time. And it's not really going to have any sort of direct benefit to your performance on that day or long-term benefit, of subsequent sessions over time. So you want to make sure that you're using your time effectively and your warm-ups are more directed than that. They're more intentional. Next, we want to look at injury risk management. We want to look at addressing any maybe deficits in active range of motion. Do you have any sort of bilateral discrepancies? Do you have any sort of pain that maybe we need to address or rehab or deal with? We need to make sure that we're building up positional tolerance in areas that maybe you're lacking on. So these are all things that we can address very effectively through an intentionally designed warm-up. So these are the primary objectives of the warm-up, in my opinion. Now, some common mistakes that I see people making when it comes to warm-ups. The first is spending 30 or 40 minutes doing a bunch of bullshit, wasting your time. The reality is a warm-up should take 5 to 10 minutes at the most. You don't need more than 5 to 10 minutes to warm up effectively. Now, there are going to be some very, very limited cases where that does not necessarily apply. So for instance, an example of that might be someone who has a legitimate injury and their rehab just takes a long time to do, or maybe they just need a longer time to warm up because they actually, again, have an injury. So that's one example. But again, in the vast majority of cases, 5 to 10 minutes is absolutely the most amount of time you should be spending on a warm up. Don't waste your time, get in there, be effective, utilize your time efficiently. The next thing is doing non-specific drills. So again, going back to the example of walking on the treadmill in order to prepare for a really heavy bench session, that's not really going to do a whole lot of anything. I see people constantly using Theraguns and foam rolling and just basically jerking off in there. It makes no sense. You want to make sure that you're targeting the specific motor patterns that you're going to be training on that day. So your warm-ups should be specific and they should pertain to the training you're actually doing on that day. Now, the third thing, and this isn't necessarily always the case because you don't always need to progress your prep work, but there are several instances where you probably should progress your prep work. For instance, if you're doing bottom-up kettlebell overhead presses and at first your shoulder stability is really trash. So maybe you're only doing like a 15-pound kettlebell or something like that. You're doing that and after a while you're like, oh, okay, your stability improves and all that stuff is great. But then you don't actually increase the load. You don't do any, maybe like more sets. You're not doing them in different planes. Whatever ways you might need to progress your lift, you should be progressing your lifts in a lot of different contexts. Now, like I said, you don't always have to. So for instance, an example where you maybe don't want to progress your prep work is in flexibility. So if you already have the flexibility to squat below parallel and you're a powerlifter, you probably don't actually even want to work on enhancing your range of motion more, because that might actually make you perform less effectively. So there are limitations to this, of course, but there's plenty of instances where you actually do want to progress your prep work to see better results. But again, that's kind of a case-by-case thing. I did want to throw it out there, though, because it is an important consideration for certain activities. Now, here's how you can get more out of your prep work. And this is basically what I do with the vast majority of my athletes. First, we select 3 to 4 relevant exercises for that day that pertain to the training that we're doing. We do them back to back in a logical sequence without rest, and we repeat this for 2 to 3 total sets. Now, what does this do? First, it gets our bodies warm Two, it preps the movements that we're preparing to do on that day. So for instance, if we are doing a bench day, I'm a huge fan of bottom-up kettlebell overhead presses, maybe doing some shoulder extension work, some end range contractions, maybe doing some band pull aparts, warming up the back, maybe doing some push-up plus. These are all potential examples of things we do. But again, you do them back to back in a logical sequence, get your core temperature up, get sweating, get breathing a little bit heavy. And by the end of it, you've done 12 different sets essentially, right? And that should only take you about 5 minutes, 10 minutes tops, right? Including all the setup and all that jazz. Shouldn't take you longer than 5 or 10 minutes. So that's basically how I like to structure my warmups. Now, I want to give a little bit of a case study to kind of explain some of the potential benefits that you might see when you're actually doing your warmups. So I coach a lifter who, when they first came to me, they were experiencing shoulder pain. This is something they dealt with for years. At this point, it had been about 2 years they had been experiencing this. They tried a bunch of different stuff, but nothing really seemed to consistently work and consistently get them out of pain. So what we did was we actually reviewed, and you know, I want to be very clear, like this was a much more comprehensive intake and conversation we actually had to address these issues, but I'm just kind of giving you the Coles note. So we did review their lifting history and the primary triggers, and we identified 2 main triggers that actually caused them pain. The first was not being warm enough, and the second was range of motion. So when they went into the extended range of motion at the bottom of the bench press, that's where you get the most amount of compression on that biceps tendon and the shoulder in general. So that was where they started experiencing pain. The second thing was that they noticed that if they had, let's say, 3 sets, they would experience pain. But if they were doing 5 or 6 sets, by the time they got to the 5th or 6th set, the pain would actually go away and they'd actually feel pretty good. So that's why we were able to determine that it was range of motion as well as not warming up effective or sufficiently. And those were the primary triggers that they were experiencing. Now, the next thing was we started to look at prioritizing scapular stability and active range of motion in various loaded drills. I noticed they weren't able to maintain good stability of their scapula when they go down, get to the bottom, and their shoulders would dump forward. And I suspected that this may be contributing to the pain. Now, again, positions and technique, it's kind of a very complex association to pain. So I don't necessarily want to sit here and say that if you bench in this way or this way, it's going to either protect you from injury or it's going to guarantee you're going to get injured. It's not that simple. However, in this particular case, that was something that I suspected, as well as going over a lot of other details around this particular athlete. That was something that we looked at, and it ended up being the case. So this was a specific warm-up that I created for the lifter. Very simple prep work. Like I said, it took them about 5 minutes to do. Now, the first thing we did was we did a doorway stretch and then some end range contractions. So doorway stretch is basically you go up to doorway, you're at 90-90 position, you're stretching your pecs out because they were really, really tight. They had terrible range of motion. And this was a big limiting factor for them. So we do some stretching, and this was static stretching, and then we followed that up with an isometric end range contraction, working on their external rotation specifically. Now, we also did some internal rotation and range contractions as well, but the primary focus was on external rotation. Next, we focused on bottom-up kettlebell overhead press. We protracted the shoulders as we were doing these, so we're getting a little bit more serratus recruitment, really helping to stabilize the shoulder blade through that scapular rhythm, which ended up, again, being really helpful for improving their range of motion and their stability and control through that range of motion. Next, we used a supine cable pullover, again, just to enhance the range of motion, to stretch out their lats. Their lats were incredibly tight. Their overhead position was really garbage. So this allowed them to get under load while still actually enhancing the range of motion, because at the end, it was actually going to pull them down. So it was really exaggerating that overhead position. And while they were under load, that's creating a little bit more of a chronic change because it is a loaded drill. It's not just a passive drill. Next, we started working on some cable shoulder extensions. So again, they lacked shoulder extension. They lacked basic external rotation, internal rotation. They basically just lacked general shoulder mobility, which is what we needed to do. So we would do 15 reps of shoulder extensions. They basically loop their hands in a rope and do extensions. And once they were at the max extension that they could reach, they would hold that for a 3 count. So they'd get into extension, 1, 2, 3, do the next rep. We would do 15 repetitions of that. They would do that sequence 3 times, and then they would actually start their actual primary training. Okay. Now, what ended up happening? Well, within 1 week, all of their symptoms were gone. All of their symptoms. He didn't experience any pain. He didn't experience any sort of discomfort. He noticed that he just felt better. He wasn't anticipating pain. And all of these things were huge because in his particular case, what it allowed us to do was it allowed us to actually increase volume and intensity because he was actually training below what he needed to in order to get the results that he wanted because he was trying to avoid pain. So it allowed us to increase his output to get better results for his strength and hypertrophy. So this is a really important thing. You don't want to be in pain. You want to make sure you're training for longevity. And this is something that I think a lot of lifters don't really pay enough attention to is longevity. If you feel good, if you're not in pain, if you're just, everything's gelling, everything's vibing, you can have the high output and you can be in the game for a long time. If you look at the athletes that are the most muscular and the most strong, generally they're the ones who were in it for 15 or 20 years. So this is not just about whether you have amazing genetics. Like obviously you need amazing genetics to be the best in the world, but if you want to get incredibly strong, you don't necessarily need to have elite genetics. But if you stay in the game for 10, 15, 20 years, I guarantee you, you're going to go incredibly far. But in order to do that, you need to stay injury-free or at least minimize, injuries as best as you can. Now, here's some additional considerations that I think are very important to point out. First, injury is complex. As I already said earlier, you should talk to a physical therapist if you are in pain or if you do have an injury. They are the ones who should be addressing this because it is very complex. And I certainly wouldn't be able to diagnose you or do anything like that. That's out of my scope. And that's something that I still do with my lifters is I will refer them out when I think it's beyond what my capabilities are. So it's really important. The next thing is you want to make sure that you're doing prep work and warm-ups, but that's no guarantee that you won't get injured. Okay. It is a best practice, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you won't get injured or that you won't be in pain. However, in my experience, prep work is incredibly important and it does confer a protective effect. Now, that's not something that's necessarily scientifically proven because in this case, we're talking about injuries and prep work and all that stuff. It is pretty convoluted and there's a lot of different variables, there's a lot of moving parts. However, just from practical experience and from talking to some incredible coaches and incredible lifters, they all seem to concur that doing effective prep work does seem to confer a protective benefit from an injury risk standpoint. So hopefully that helps you guys. I hope you enjoyed the videos and you can take this away and improve the quality of your warm-ups and hopefully the quality of your training that follows. If you liked the damn video and you got all the way here, make sure you subscribe, make sure you like it, make sure you share it with your friends who are doing stupid shit and just a bunch of mental masturbation in the gym, foam rolling for 45 minutes. Send it to them so they can get better results as well. Thanks so much, guys. I'll see you on the next video.